Good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, HR Advice on Real Scenarios and Real Advice. Hope you're all having a wonderful morning today. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. So essentially, you should be able to see my screen now. And these are the rules, beg your pardon. So your microphone is muted automatically. So if you're going to cough or sneeze, don't worry, you're not going to interrupt anything at all. We're not going to be able to hear you, even if you've got the radio on in the background, you're absolutely fine. There are 3 handouts attached to today's webinar. You've got a copy of the slides and also a generous handout as well from our guest speakers. More on those in a moment. Also, if you could send your questions in using that speech bubble and the question mark, click on that, send your questions in. If we've got time, we'll go through them. If not, we'll catch up with you afterwards at the end via email. Now, I did mention today's speakers, so let's go through some introductions. Who am I? Well, I'm Matt Batty. I'm a learning facilitator here at Sage, and I'm joined as well by Emily Bennett, who's a Senior Advisor plus HR Technical Consultant and Team Coach and Senior HR Advisor, and Denise Villeneuve, and they're going to share their expertise on this topic and to get us into the practicalities on what you can do to prevent any risks. So over to you, Emily.
Hi, so my name is Emily. So I've worked in HR for just over 10 years now, and I've worked with a number of different business types. So I've worked with within the health sector, telecommunications, with utility companies, and also with builders merchants as well. I've got a level 7 CIPD and I have a master's degree in HR management, and my role at Advisor Plus as the HR technical consultant, it involves me supporting the advisory team. So if you ever call up our advice line and you're speaking to some of the advisors, I work in the background to support them with any complex or high risk cases, anything that needs a little bit of a legal oversight, and I also focus on upskilling and training the team with any legislative changes as well. And I will hand over to my colleague Denise so that she can introduce herself.
Fab, thanks, Em. Morning, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Denise. I've worked in HR for 10 years. I'm a team coach and senior advisor at AP, supporting the team of advisors to provide HR service to the Sage client. I've had experience dealing with various different HR issues, topics such as performance capability, grievance, high-risk cases, disciplinary cases, and flexible working. And I support the team, a little bit like Em said, with the advice line, providing guidance and dealing with managers to support them with their HR issues within their business.
Super, brilliant introductions there. So what are we going to be looking at today? Well, today we'll be covering some real life cases that Emily and Denise and their colleagues have managed in their time on the advice line and in their HR careers, with a particular focus on the differences between conduct and capability and why it's important to get the process right from the start. Now, we're going to go over how to try and tell whether an employee's actions are conduct or capability based, some cases that toe the line between the two and the process that was followed and why, and then addressing common challenges and avoiding legal risks when managing performance and conduct cases, and some examples of employment tribunals that demonstrate where businesses can get it wrong. We'll make sure that at the end of the webinar you can access the slides, and we've used that throughout this webinar. As I say, the handout is attached, and we're going to share the webinar recording with you as well, so you can watch it back on demand and share any links on the portal of the policies and areas you need to pay particular attention to. We'll share more on how to access these just at the end of this session, but let's get going, shall we? So Emily, if you could get started, what is the difference between conduct and capability?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there is differences between the two, and it's really important that we understand what they are when we're managing employees. So conduct, or a disciplinary situation, is when someone chooses to act in a certain manner, so either consciously or subconsciously, and that way in which they've behaved is against company policies and against company procedures. So this can include minor behaviours, which would be classed as misconduct, and their actions like lateness, like minor insubordination, and minor dress code violations. It can also include much more serious behaviour, and this would normally be classed as gross misconduct. And this includes behaviours such as physical violence, fraud, theft, bullying and harassment, and serious health and safety breaches. The idea of conduct is that somebody is acting in a willful manner, so they have control over their actions. It's that they know what they should be doing and they are able to do that, but for whatever reason they decide to act in another manner. It's that they will not do what they're supposed to do, that they will not do their job, or they will not follow an instruction. Capability or performance issues, on the other hand, are when someone cannot do what they're supposed to do, and that's commonly because of a skills or a knowledge gap. So this suggests that there is a certain lack of control over the situation. So, for example, they can't change their way of working immediately because they need some support and help to be able to do that, to able to better themselves, to meet those performance standards. There are a couple of questions, therefore, that managers can ask themselves when they're trying to ascertain whether a behaviour is conduct or whether it's capability. So, for example, you can ask yourself the question, this behaviour that I'm seeing, is it a will issue or is it a skill issue? Is the behaviour that I'm seeing someone who will not do what they're being asked to do, or someone that cannot do what they're being asked to do?
Fab. So that's a really good point you just made there about whether someone can change their behaviour immediately or not. So thank you, Em. So for example, if someone is on their mobile phone, wasting time, or if someone is choosing not to follow hygiene regulations, these behaviours that can be changed straight away. These are more conduct issues. Therefore, you should only need to tell the employee once that their behaviour is wrong, and hopefully it can be stopped. So this is an example of conduct, a conduct issue rather than a behaviour. So the difference here is, whereas if it's a skill issue, you couldn't expect that same immediate reaction. So for example, if someone wasn't following a hygiene routine because they've not had the training about what colour boards they should be using, or if they're struggling to remember all the different rules, they would not be able to change that straight away, no matter how hard they tried. They'd need some training, some time, time to improve, and maybe someone supporting them with the changes and the expectations before they can actually make a change. Therefore, this suggests this is more of a capability issue.
That makes sense. So thanks for the explanations, and it's good to see how there's a difference between the two, like a defining line, as it were. Now, what do you do where you don't really know where it falls? Because I imagine that there are some behaviours that could potentially fall into either.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that this is really common. It's quite a common question we get on the advice line a lot. So there are behaviours where it's not clear what the root cause is. So for example, if you worked in a bakery and someone is meant to be baking 100 cakes a day, but their output is 60 cakes a day, you would want to understand the reason for it and explore it in a bit more detail. So it could be that the employee is spending too much time chatting or messing about, and that's why their output is low. Or it could be that they're just slower with baking because they feel that they need to triple check something and go over things, or because they're making mistakes and have to rebake batches. So sometimes it isn't super obvious what the difference is. So in these situations, the advice we give to a manager is to sit down with the employee and have an informal conversation to try and get to the bottom of what's going on before deciding the process and next steps to follow. So you could try asking them to explain the processes, or to explain how they go about completing their tasks, and how they manage their day. And this might help you to understand what the issue is. So for example, if an employee is able to explain all the processes, but when you ask them how they structure their day, it's clear that they're not putting the effort in, this would suggest it's more of a conduct issue. If it's more that they're struggling to confidentially complete or explain the process, it's more like a capability issue. So if in doubt, after a conversation, you could look to manage the issue as capability. If you do see an improvement in the performance and behaviour, this does demonstrate that the colleague does know what they're supposed to be doing and they are able to deliver what's needed of them in their role. Once you stop monitoring the behaviour, if it dips again, you might be more inclined to say it's a conduct, because they've previously been able to demonstrate that they are able to do what's asked of them in their role.
I get you. So that's really interesting. Have either of you had any cases where this has come up where you're unsure on what kind of route to follow?
Yeah, I'm sure we both have, and I'm sure that every HR professional will have come across this as well. But yeah, I'll go first. So I had a case, it was a good few years ago now, where we had a colleague who was a mechanic and who was making some real mistakes in the garage when they were fixing the vehicles. So these were really quite serious mistakes. So things like not tightening the tyres back on properly, which obviously, once those vehicles were then sent out with drivers in them, could have caused a real issue for the drivers, if something was to go wrong with that vehicle whilst it was, out on a road. It had got to the point where the managers and the other team members were having to watch everything that this employee did, and they were having to double check every vehicle before it went out, obviously for the safety of the drivers. But when we spoke to that employee and were asking them, kind of what the problem was, it seemed to be a genuine case that the employee just struggled to recall exactly what it was they were supposed to be checking off before a vehicle was, leaving the garage. So because of that, because it felt more of a cannot situation than a will not, we decided to put them on a performance management plan. And as we started with that, we noticed some health concerns with the colleague as well. So we noticed that they seemed distracted. We noticed that they seemed just generally unwell within themselves, that they had headaches, that they had shivers. And we were obviously concerned about them from a welfare perspective. So again, we spoke to the employee and they actually admitted that they'd previously been taking marijuana, but they decided to go cold turkey because they wanted to be sober. They didn't want to take it anymore. But that they were really struggling with the withdrawal symptoms at this point. Now, at this stage, we had to pause and really think about how to proceed, because there was now a question mark about, is this a performance situation where it was that the employee could not do their job, that they needed training and help and support, or actually was this a situation where the employee had willfully put themselves in a situation that was having a negative impact on their work? So had they knowingly took this drug, knowing that it could potentially, impair their abilities and their judgment calls in work? We spoke with the employee and the business at length about what we wanted to do, and we decided to continue with performance management and also to put some welfare measures in place to support them. The reason we did this is that the employee was really keen to remain sober. They were really keen to do a better job, and they really valued the job at that company. And so therefore, because they've come forward, because they've been honest about what had happened and that they were trying to be better, we decided to continue with the performance process. As I said, we put some welfare measures in place, and that included, at the employee's request, for them to be drug tested monthly for 12 months, just to help them and support them with trying to remain sober. As the plan continued, the employee's symptoms started to lessen because obviously they weren't taking that drug anymore. And it became clear that actually there was an underlying performance issue as well that wasn't necessarily related to the drug use. And so we continued to make our way through that process. Unfortunately, the employee was unable to succeed in that role. As I said, that performance issue did continue on, and obviously we couldn't keep them in that role when they were making such mistakes. But what we ended up doing was moving them into another role within the business. They were actually a really good employee, and it was great that there was something that we could slot them into that they were passionate about and that they were really keen to explore and that worked for the business. So it ended up being, quite a good news story in the end. But this example, it shows that sometimes your processes don't necessarily go from A to B. They don't necessarily go the way you expect them to. But there are ways and means that you can still find positive outcomes for both the employees involved and for the business as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that case there sounded like it had some twists and turns, certainly. And this is probably, I think, at this stage, a good time to recap on what performance management can look like and the key risks that you want to look out for. Denise, are you okay to help me with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we said earlier, the thing with conduct is that you should be able to tell the employee their behaviour is wrong and expect it to stop immediately. But when dealing with performance, it's a bit lengthier than that. So for a conduct process, we would generally expect to see an attempt to resolve the concerns informally first. So initially, this might just be an informal conversation where you try and understand what's going on and what's wrong with the employee and why they're struggling. Sometimes this can just be enough to get the performance back on track because it might have just been a misunderstanding, or with some hints and tips and some support, the colleague can get on track and do what they need to do within their role. Where this doesn't work, the business would then look to put a performance improvement plan in place with some smart objectives to support the employee in achieving their targets. So, as we've said before, it's important to note that the colleague does need support to change their work, so they can think about what they might need to do, such as time away from the business, or retraining, or shadowing a colleague and practicing some of the skills and completing tasks. So if the performance continues not to improve, the employee would work their way through the process and should receive warnings to let them know that they're not succeeding on the plan. So if the performance ultimately does not improve, the employee can be dismissed. So in terms of risk, businesses should be assessing whether there's other options available before reaching the point of dismissal. So one example we had, like Emily explained, is for the employee to look at alternative roles in the business they might be better suited to, or even looking at more junior roles within their department. It's part of ACAS really in terms of guidance around dismissals. They should be a last option. So it is really important to think outside the box for when considering next steps and dealing with these processes. So the other point to really think about is any underlying health conditions that are contributing to the underperformance, and how the employee can be supported and what adjustments they may need within their role to help them support them. So an example of this would be if an employee has dyslexia and is making spelling mistakes or data input errors, there's likely to be a connection between the two. So likewise, if someone's struggling with an upsell of an item or dealing with customers, but they have a neurodiversity that affects their ability in conversations or social situations, again, there's likely to be a link. So these underlying conditions can be classed as disabilities under the Equality Act. So it's really important to get it right when supporting and going through these types of processes. So one thing to remember, the definition of a disability is a long term. So it's something that has or is likely to last at least 12 months. So it's something that has substantial impact on day-to-day activities. So things like lifting a kettle or holding a conversation. So if in doubt, you can look to get further medical information from occupational health, but we would suggest erring on the side of caution when required when it comes to dealing with these colleagues and supporting them through a performance process.
Yeah, thanks for that, Denise. And I think that it is really important that we're offering all this relevant support. You know, there is a legal obligation to support colleagues who have underlying health conditions that would be covered by the Equality Act. But I think the other important thing to note as well is that you can still performance manage someone who has an underlying health condition, as long as you can demonstrate that you've been supportive in your approach and that you've been reasonable in your approach as well. So I can think of an example that I had that relates to this. So I had a case where we had a colleague who was hired as a telephony agent. So their main role realistically was answering the phone and taking calls from customers and to answer their queries and, you know, triage them to the right place. But they had an underlying health condition of anxiety, and this began to be exacerbated by the type of work that they were doing. So on the phones, they would particularly struggle, you know, if the customer was a bit difficult or if it was a really difficult question that didn't have a straightforward answer. It would really kind of set off their anxiety, which was obviously having an impact both on them from a welfare perspective, but also on the level of customer service that they were able to give out within their role. What we did was we did an occupational health referral to try and understand what adjustments we could put in place to help the agent. But what the agents actually wanted was to be removed from the phones and to be put on back office duties. Now, the business could accommodate the agent working back office duties from time to time, doing bits here and there, but their main role was to answer the calls and to triage them, or, you know, to deal with them in the right way, answer the questions. And that's ultimately what we needed a person within that role to be able to do. So what we did was we put a performance plan in place to support the agent. So we identified that, you know, maybe there was a bit of a skills gap, an understanding gap of how they could triage those calls, how they could handle those difficult phone calls. So we put all of that in place to support them with handling those type of calls. And then this was overlaid with additional guidance from occupational health, things such as additional breaks. You know, if they had a difficult call, being able to come and have a little chat with the manager so that they could talk it through and understand, you know, what they could have done differently. So for this case, the business continued to manage this via the performance process, because ultimately what you have to do is you have to weigh up the reasonable adjustments against the requirements of the role and understand whether they're reasonable. So is it reasonable to allow a telephony agent to permanently not work on the phones? Probably not. In this case, you would either need to continue to manage them via the process and to try and support them, you know, in achieving what they need to in that role, making sure you're providing all of that relevant support, all of that training to help them succeed. Or on the other hand, the business and the employee could consider whether another role would be better suited for them. You know, is this the right role for them? Again, in this case, the employee was unwilling to move roles. They wanted to do the back office work, which isn't a job in itself, and there wasn't enough of that to quantify it being a job in itself. And at the same time, they also wanted to be paid the level of the telephony agent role, but to not actually take any telephone calls. So the employee was unwilling to look at other roles. They wanted to remain in this role, with the adjustment of them not actually taking the calls. So we ended up continuing with the performance management process. And in the end, we had to exit them from the business because they had been contracted to a certain role, which was to answer the phones, and they could not do that role. Again, it's important to overlay as part of that process, we were really clear about what support we put in place and what reasonable adjustments we put in place, so that if we were ever challenged on it, we could be clear that we'd done everything we could to support that person, and that when we got to the dismissal, that was the last option we had available to us as a business. In these situations, it can be helpful where a performance management policy has a clause in it that specifies that the business is able to either expedite the process or to skip steps where the underperformance is absolutely essential and integral to the role. So, for example, in this one, this was a telephony agent who was unable to take any telephone calls. That is absolutely integral to that role, and obviously would have a large impact on the business whilst you are trying to manage that performance. So it can help where you've got that clause in to say, if it's absolutely integral to the role and it's causing operational difficulties, that you are able, to skip steps or to expedite the process.
Again, thanks for that. That completely makes sense, especially in that scenario. Speaking of scenarios, have you got any kind of other examples of cases where it's been hard to judge whether it is performance or conduct?
Yeah, I've got one, so I'll go through that. So another common one is that we have people forgetting to do something as part of the role. So an example of this is I've had a case where a colleague was continually not completing security checks for customers before providing sensitive information, and this was being brought up again and again on quality calls when the manager was listening in. So the manager followed our advice and guidance to hold an informal conversation with the colleague as to why they were unclear, why they were continually failing to complete the security questions at the start of their call. So from this conversation, the facts were established that the colleague did know that they were supposed to be doing the security checks. They did know what information they were supposed to be asking for, and they did know why they were being asked to do this and the potential consequences of not doing the security at the start of the call. So there were also previous calls demonstrating that the employee had completed security on occasions, but on other calls, they did not always do it. So when asked why they'd failed to complete the security, the only answers the employee was able to provide was either that they didn't know or that they just kept forgetting. So there were no underlying conditions for this employee either that we were aware of. And so for this one, the manager did query if there was a performance management process that they could complete for the employee not doing the security questions as part of the performance matrix. And they were also saying that they were forgetting to do the things they were asked to be doing when they were completing security on the call. So if we consider the questions that we talked about earlier at the start of the webinar, this is an example of a skills issue. So the colleague has been able to explain the correct process, the reasons for it, and also demonstrate that they're able to do it on calls. So therefore, we need to consider whether this is someone who could not do their role, again, where there's examples where the employee has not completed the security questions. So there were no underlying health conditions for this employee to suggest that the actions were outside of the colleague's control, and whilst the colleague could explain the consequences of not completing security correctly, they did not seem seem overly concerned really with the fact that they were not doing it on every single call. So when you think of this situation from a time perspective as well, it's not the behaviour that's the time and the issue, and it's time to support the employee, but it's something that we can expect to be changed immediately. So by asking the employee to do the security, they should be able to change this immediately if the employee was paying more attention and putting the steps in place to make sure that they were completing the security questions on every call. So as such, talking everything through and taking everything into account, this situation was dealt with as a conduct process and a sanction was given as appropriate.
That's a really good example, and it's funnily I've got one kind of the other way where we thought it was conduct on the face but turned out to be otherwise. So yeah, I have an opposite one. So again, it was another telephony agent who was handling customer queries, providing a service, triaging, and we had a complaint in from a customer to say that they felt the agent had been really rude to them on the phone. So the first thing the manager did was to listen to the call. Now, they acknowledged that the employee hadn't been out and out rude, there hadn't been any bad language or anything like that, but the agent was quite blunt and was quite matter of fact with the customer. Now, on the face of it, you could think that this was conduct, it's a behaviour that's within their control, and it's something that we could expect an immediate change on. So if we asked people to improve their tone, we would expect that to happen immediately. However, when the manager sat down with the colleague informally to discuss it in the first instance, they played the phone call back for the agent, and the agent was unable to identify where they'd been rude. They were unable to identify what they'd done wrong, and they were unable to identify where they could have done better. So then having more of that conversation with the agent, they disclosed that they'd been diagnosed as neurodiverse, and that they believed part of the symptoms of that were that they struggled to pick up on things like social cues and tones of other people when they were talking to them. So in this way, it became apparent that actually this behaviour wasn't completely within the agent's control, and actually maybe the business had taken for granted that this agent understood what was expected of them. Was there a skills gap and a knowledge gap that maybe we'd taken for granted, and was the training that we could put in place to help this employee achieve and what we wanted them to achieve? So this one was managed via a performance plan because it was felt that it was more of a cannot situation than a will not situation, because the employee was keen to do a good job, they just didn't really know what was expected of them. So again, we put in support from occupational health, and all of that support was put in place. So it was things like one-to-one training with the manager to understand how to handle difficult calls, what phrases to look out for, what little minute changes in tone to look out for in customers to know that maybe it wasn't going the way that they wanted it to go. We also looked at how the agent could present themselves on the call. So what type of phrases could that agent use to present themselves on a call in the way that maybe the customer would expect them to do so? We also did practice calls with the agent so that they could develop. We did additional call listening with the agent so that they could have an opportunity to reflect on their own calls over and over, and to see if they could identify, differences in how the calls went, and, could they see how they were changing their tone and how that meant their calls were going, in a different way. They were going more positively. In this scenario, it was really good news because the performance plan worked. It goes to show that taking the time to really understand what's going on with somebody, to talk something through with someone first, it demonstrated that actually this person had a training and a skills gap that we had totally taken for granted as people that were not neurodiverse. And this employee actually really flourished once they understood what good performance looked like, what a good call sounded like, and what was expected of them and the boundaries they were working towards. They absolutely flourished within that role. So it was a really good news story. This is one of those examples, though, where had the employee not improved, the customer service element is such a large part of that role that the business may have had to have gone all the way through the process, even though there was potentially an underlying health condition contributing. So that would have been another example where we'd have needed to demonstrate that we'd done everything possible. We'd put all the support and reasonable adjustments in place before we started proceeding and before we'd got to that end of that process and potentially looked at dismissing.
Again, some great examples there, especially how you can think it's one thing, but then after having that conversation and actually discussing it, it can turn out to be something completely different, something else. On the vein of that then, is there any tips you can think of for managing performance and conduct cases that, maybe managers sometimes do fall foul of?
Yeah, so I would say for performance, make sure that your objectives are fair and that they are focused on what the individuals to give. So remember, the objectives should be SMART objectives, so meaning specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So I've had some cases before where, say, an area manager has looked to put a branch manager on a performance improvement plan because the branch was underperforming when it comes to financial targets. So that's totally understandable, given that the branch manager within their role will have targets to meet. But what if the financial performance of the branch is outside the branch manager's control? These are things that you could maybe think about. So if the branch manager is doing everything they can, if they're doing all the right things for upselling and marketing and making sure the employees know what they need to do and they're trained, but the branch is underperforming because the customers are spending less due to the cost of living, or for example, head office has made the decision to increase all the prices massively and now people are spending less, how is this within the branch manager's control? So I think it's really important to think and consider for performance really on this one. It's not as easy as just looking at performance targets and putting a person on a plan. So you really have to dig into why something's going wrong so you can ensure that firstly they're following the correct process, and secondly that you're being fair to the employee. So in this example, let's say it was down to the branch manager. This is another example of where it could be a conduct or performance. So maybe the branch manager is not doing what they've been asked to do. That would be conduct. Or maybe the branch manager is doing what is within their capabilities, but actually they're missing the key skill that could help with their targets. So that would be more around performance. So I would say don't fall into the trap of just because performance targets isn't being reached. That means a performance process shouldn't automatically be implemented. You need to consider the two and really get into conversations of why and what's happening and the root cause of the issues and explore everything.
Yeah, thanks for that, Denise. I think another good point for performance is making sure that you allow the employee the opportunity to try and improve, and to make sure you're being crystal clear about what the underperformance issues are, what you're expecting to see from them, and alongside that, what are the potential consequences if they don't improve, and making sure the employee knows where they're up to in the process. There was a case that went through Employment Tribunal in 2023, and this was Mr. Piashinsky versus Leaker's Bakery, and that really brought these issues to life of how to handle a performance case. So Mr. Piashinsky was dismissed following performance issues, and ended up taking the bakery to Employment Tribunal, and they upheld their claims that it was unfair because a proper process hadn't been followed. So Mr. Piashinsky claimed that they had no knowledge that their performance was under scrutiny before their dismissal, and the bakery disputed this and said that they did know. However, when it came down to it and what evidence was produced at the Employment Tribunal, it turned out that the bakery had left notes on Mr. Piashinsky's workstation, stating things like there's too many holes in your bread and customers won't be happy about this many holes being in the bread. But there was no proper meetings, there were no proper discussions or a structured process or a plan. It wasn't laid out what the objectives were, what support was going to be put in place for Mr. Piashinsky. There was nothing like that. The tribunal also noted that these letters and notes that were left on the workbench were written in English, and that the company was well aware that Mr. Piashinsky couldn't read English very well. And again, this demonstrated that the company had not given the employee the fair opportunity to improve, and it hadn't given them fair warning of their intention that, you know, if the underperformance continued, that they would be looking at a potential dismissal. The final meeting in which Mr. Piashinsky was dismissed was also held without notice, and Mr. Piashinsky was told that they weren't entitled to bring a representative to accompany them to this formal meeting, and both of these things are against the ACAS guidelines as well. The Employment Tribunal did take into account that Mr. Piashinsky was underperforming, but they noted that the employee had been given no fair opportunity to improve. There was no solid evidence provided at the time of their dismissal that there were serious performance issues or that it had been managed appropriately, and also that no fair procedure had been followed. So there were no invite letters, outcome letters, meeting notes, or any type of discussion or plan. And because of all of this, Mr. Piashinsky was awarded just over £15,000 at Employment Tribunal. So again, this is an example where even if you feel the underperformance is really, really clear, even if it's causing a massive issue for your business, it's so important to sit down with the employee to understand what's going on, why is it going on, making sure they're given a really clear opportunity to improve, that they've been offered the relevant support and guidance to meet that improvement, and that you continue through a clear and fair process before you start to issue out any sanctions, and certainly before you start considering dismissing anyone.
Absolutely. And what about disciplinary, Emily?
Yeah, I think the same thing would stand for disciplinary. Don't make presumptions, really, is what we're saying with all of this. In the first instance, you should always be seeking to understand. If you can take anything away from this, it should be when you walk into these conversations, seek to understand. Seek to understand what's gone wrong. Seek to understand why it's gone wrong so that you can then deal with it appropriately. Don't make those presumptions. Don't fill in the gaps for the employee. Ask those open questions to allow them to give you their version of events. This is apparent in one of the more well-known cases from last year, and that was of Mr. Borgnale versus Lloyds Bank. So briefly, Mr. Borgnale was dismissed after using a racial slur during a training session. That training session was regarding diversity and inclusion, and they were dismissed because Lloyds has a zero-tolerance stance on race and language, which seems common sense, seems like a relatively straightforward decision to make there. However, there was an awful lot of context behind this situation. So Mr. Borgnale had used this word as part of a genuine question about how he should handle overhearing that word being used. And Mr. Borgnale referred to the fact that they often heard this slur being used in both rap music and also between members of the Black community. And Mr. Borgnale wanted to understand what he should do when he heard this word. Upon realising that his use of that full word in that session had caused upset, Mr. Borgnale apologised immediately and did not repeat the word again. They also disclosed as part of the investigation that they had dyslexia, and one of the symptoms of that was that they said what was on their mind for fear that they were going to lose their train of thought. So sometimes they spoke before they'd had full time to process what was going to, come out of their mouth. So in this scenario, the Employment Tribunal did find that the use of that word was, of course, shocking and potentially upsetting. It's not a word that you would normally hear, in work conversation. But that in the context of the training and in Mr. Borgneil's use of the word, he was genuinely attempting to gain more of an understanding and to learn what was and was not appropriate. And at the end of the day, that was the intention of that training in the first place. It was diversity and inclusion training. Where people were, meant to be learning about this type of thing and what was okay and what wasn't okay. They held, the Employment Tribunal, that Lloyds Bank could have looked to give Mr. Borgneil a sanction, so a warning if they wanted to, to demonstrate that the use of the word wasn't okay, but that to dismiss in this scenario amounted to unfair dismissal, given that Mr. Borgneil had worked for them for a number of years and had an unblemished record to this point. Mr. Borgneil was awarded £490,000 for this instance. So this again highlights why it is so important to have that seek to understand mindset from the beginning. Whilst the use of that slur is 100% not okay and it's not expected in a work environment, there was so much context around this situation that helps with the understanding of why Mr. Borgneil had used that word, and it should have really had an effect on the potential reasonable outcomes when Lloyds were looking at that case.
Absolutely. And that is some great advice and some really interesting examples throughout the discussion that we've had there today. So thank you both for sharing your thoughts with us on those scenarios. Really useful insight. What I want to do now, if it's okay with you both, is just drift over to the questions, because we've had a few come in. I've randomly selected a couple at first. The first one that I noted was, if we think that someone is purposefully taking more sickness absence than they need, would this be performance or would this be conduct?
I can take that one. So a lot of businesses have a separate process that they use for managing absence, but this often includes formal meetings with a number of warnings before the company considers dismissing them. So overlying this, the business would also need to consider reasonable adjustments and any risks involved regarding underlying health conditions. So unless you have evidence to suggest that the colleague has been dishonest about their absences, then sickness absence should be treated as genuine and dealt with via the appropriate sickness absence process. So in terms of what this looks like, it shouldn't be that if you believe the colleague has come back 2 days after sickness absence rather than 3, you have to remember that every colleague is affected by sickness absence in different ways, and you have to consider the needs of the individual unless they have specific facts that would maybe suggest that the employee could have returned earlier. So maybe an example of this could be that if someone is called in sick on Monday, but there's pictures of them on social media where they're out watching the football game instead, this would be a clear discrepancy in the version of events that the employee is given to you. So if we think back to what we discussed earlier, would this be will or skill? If it's somebody who won't do their job or can't do their job, it's conduct, because the employee knows that they should have done what they should have done and how they should have done things differently. So as we've said before, generally absence should be managed via the process rather than specifically via a performance or conduct process.
Spot on. The second question that I picked out was, we have a colleague that is underperforming. Would it be easier for us to do redundancy than go through a lengthy performance process?
I'll grab that one. It might feel like it's easier right now, but unfortunately, no, it's not going to be easier later down the line, because it's likely to be seen as unfair. So yeah, unfortunately, no, you can't use redundancy in place of underperformance. And the law is very, very clear on redundancies. It can only be used where the role in and of itself is no longer required. It can't be used where you want to remove a specific person from that role and then hire somebody else to come in and do that job instead. If you did this, it's not going to stand up at Employment Tribunal. You'd be at risk of an unfair dismissal claim, and if they have any protected characteristics, underlying health conditions, etc., you could also be looking at a discrimination claim, which is uncapped at Employment Tribunal. So there's no maximum amount of money. It could be anything. Now, that being said, if there is a genuine redundancy situation, so if you are looking at making cuts because you know from a cost saving perspective, or because you know a specific team is going or something like that, if there's multiple employees in your selection pool, so if there's multiple employees who have been placed at risk of redundancy, so say you've got 5 and 3 of them need to leave, for example, what you can do is look at that selection criteria that you'll be using to decide who's going to go and who's going to stay. So in that instance, you could look at their performance as a factor. So let's say, for example, let's say you've got 3 bakers and you need to reduce to 2 bakers because people aren't buying as many cupcakes, so you don't need 3 people making them, for example. And let's say that one of these bakers is a lot slower, and let's say that the cakes aren't as good, you know, that they're not as fast, for example. What you could look to do is select performance as the selection criteria. You would then mark each of those 3 bakers against your performance criteria, and that person is going to come out as the lowest, so they would be the person that you're selecting. That's fair in that instance because you're using a fair selection criteria, a part of an already established redundancy process. You do have to be absolutely certain that there is a genuine need for redundancy first. As I said, you can't just fabricate a redundancy to avoid dealing with the underperformance situation. If there is an underperformance situation, you should be following your performance process. And as we said earlier, a good performance process and policy would suggest that if the underperformance is integral to the role, that this process can be expedited so that you can bring it to a quicker conclusion. What you don't want to be doing, though, is picking another process that you know isn't the right one just to try and make it go faster, because you're going to have to do more work on the back end to try and unpick it anyway.
Absolutely understand that. Great logic to that. Another question is, what do we do if we try to performance management someone, but they refuse to either engage with the process because they think they're performing fine, or if they refuse to try and be collaborative within the plan?
Yeah, that's a good one. I've had a few of these, so I'll take that one. So it is a really interesting question because it can happen quite often, and we get several cases coming through where we've had these types of discussions with managers. So when approached about performance, it can be really sensitive, and it's a topic that is quite difficult. So you have to be prepared for colleagues to react in different ways to this situation. So they may already know that there is a problem and being agreeable to the process, as they know they need some help and support. So alternatively, they may become really upset and defensive or even angry about being challenged on their performance. So you get the 2 types of different situations. So firstly, you'd want to approach this in a collaborative way. Try to understand why the employee has a different opinion to yours about their underperformance. It's also really helpful if you can come to the meeting prepared with some evidence so they can see why, and it's super clear on what the issues are, where you need to talk to the employee and go through the different situations. The last thing you want to do is tell the employee that they're underperforming, for them to say, can you give me some specifics, or can I have a better understanding, and for you not to be able to provide these examples. So hopefully this can help the employee to understand where you're coming from and what's going wrong. So you should also be super clear on the employee and the fact that the onus is not just on them. Whilst it's their performance that needs to improve, you'll also be adding to the plan with support mechanisms to help them succeed along the way. So this will hold you just as accountable as the employee in order of the plan and supporting them along the process in order for them to work it through and continue. So again, showing the employee that it's not all down to them, and help them understand the process in full. So if the colleague point blank refuses, and we have had a couple of these, to engage with the process after all this you've gone through, you would also have 2 options dependent on how they're behaving. So you could explain that the performance plan will in fact go in place and that the performance will be monitored, and the support still stands, but regardless, you'll be continuing with the process. Alternatively, if the behaviour is completely inappropriate, you may need to start a conduct process regarding the serious situation in relation to the fact that the employee is not following a reasonable management request and engaging with the process. So if you do come across any particular complicated situations such as this, you can always give us a call, or if you just need some help and support with talking through the process again, you can always give us a call for some help.
Again, it sounds like it's all about having that conversation, majority and getting that understanding. I think we've got time for one more question, and it is regarding the case with a colleague who was taking drugs. So if they had failed a drugs test, would that have been dealt with as performance or conduct?
Well, that was my case, so I will take that one. So yeah, a great question. Luckily, the colleague in my situation did not fail a drugs test because, as I said earlier, they were being very genuine when they said they wanted to come off it and they wanted to keep their job and do a good job. But yeah, obviously, we decided in that situation to deal with it via performance management. But had they have failed, the actual taking of the drugs would normally have been dealt with as a conduct issue. Obviously, everything has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis because there are such small nuances that can change the direction of the case. But for my case specifically, I think had the colleague have failed one of those monthly drug tests, it would have been dealt with as conduct, and it probably would have been dealt with as gross misconduct as well, given the nature of their role. I think it's obvious that if they were under the influence of anything, that it could have an impact on their ability to complete that job in a safe way. What we had done is when we'd agreed to do these monthly drug tests, we'd agreed right from the start that if they failed the drug test, it would be conduct and it would potentially gross misconduct and it would potentially result in the dismissal from the business. So we've been really clear with the employee from the start about, we were giving them a bit of a goodwill gesture here and this is what we expected back. Ultimately, if we have a think about those questions that we've set out before, someone taking drugs, is that someone who cannot do their job or someone who will not do their job? Is this someone who has a learning or a skills need, or is this someone who's acted in a willful manner? The thing with drugs and alcohol usage, when that's involved, it's always quite difficult because there will always be the argument to say that someone with an addiction has limited control over their actions, has limited control when it comes to their decision-making process as to whether to, engage in that activity or not. However, it would still be classed as a conduct issue because it's not that it's a learning and skills gap. It is that someone has ultimately made a choice to take it for whatever reason, and any mitigation would be taken into consideration in terms of the outcome. So I've had cases before where people have admitted to being under the influence, but that they have a problem with it, and we've then looked to maybe not dismiss but to put a really serious sanction in place along with supportive measures, with a clear suggestion that if it were to happen again, we that would potentially then result in their dismissal. But you have to weigh up the actual or the potential consequences of someone being under the influence against any mitigation that they provide. You have to weigh up what's the bigger risk. Is it having them remain in the business and trusting them to not do it again, or is it dismissing them and then having to face off any potential claim at employment tribunal? It's weighing up what's right for the employee and what's right for the business. But yeah, in that situation, it would have been conduct.
Makes sense. So thank you very much for that. Well, I hope everybody has found it a very valuable session today, as I have, to be honest with you. And if we weren't able to cover off your questions, apologies. We will follow up with you, though, personally after the session. So thank you to Emily and Denise. Thank you very much for your insight and the practical guidance that you've set out for us today. And don't forget that we have got you covered. The slides are attached. So if you want to download that handout now, and also there's an Advisor Plus handout, download that as well, and you've got some reading to do afterwards and things to reflect on, as well as that recording that's going to be sent to you. And remember, if you do like our help with anything, we've got you covered as well. So please feel free to check out any of the topics covered in the Sage HR Advice portal. Alternatively, if you're a professional or premium customer, don't hesitate to call the advice line. One of our consultants will happily provide any guidance that you need or that has been covered today. Just to let you know as well, Sage HR Advice is there to help you navigate any kind of difficult processes that you might encounter. And also for HR Advice, we have some amazing new offerings, including Small Business Toolkits, digital e-learn library, which gets updated regularly with new content, and additional services like on-site health and safety assessments. We highly recommend getting more information if it sounds like something that you'd benefit from. And I'll be launching a poll momentarily, so you can respond to that if you do want to receive more information, and we can get in contact with you. Also, we're asking you to have your say too. So you will get the opportunity to give us feedback as you exit the webinar. As you leave the virtual door, there'll be a survey sent out to you. We want to know your thoughts on topics you want covered moving forward. We listen and we read to every single comment that is sent back to us. So if there are any specific topics of areas of HR that you'd like advice on, just get in touch, let us know. Feel free to suggest these as well in the Q&A that we've got, because they're also recorded and I'll be passing those on. And as I say, you also have the webinar survey afterwards, where you can let us know how things went, what you'd like to see differently, or stick to the same plan in the future. So again, welcome to any suggestions. With webinars, the next HR Advice webinar is going to be on sexual harassment, spikes in sexual harassment cases and what to address. And that's going to be on Tuesday, 8th of July at 2 p.m. So get registered for that. What's going to be going live this afternoon. I'm now going to launch that poll. So if you would like further information on the HR advice or HR Sage HR, please answer that poll now. I'm going to leave it up for just a moment, for just around about a minute. So again, just let us know if you want us to get in touch with you. It'll be appearing on your screens in around about 20 seconds. But I think today has been very, very informative. For me, not being a specialist in the HR arena myself, it's always amazing to go through these scenarios and these examples. It's very eye-opening. And my gleam away from it was really having those conversations. Already getting some responses back on that poll there, so I'm going to leave it up for another 30 seconds and we will be in touch with you afterwards as well. Going to check on that. Excellent, superb. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And remember, if you do have any questions at all, we will be getting in touch with you afterwards. Your questions will be forwarded on. Apologies, we did slightly overrun. I think today was just far too interesting to cut it short. But again, don't worry, there isn't a question that will be left unanswered. So have no fear on that one. Okay, I'm going to close that poll now. It seems like everybody has joined in. So thank you again very much. There we are. There we have it. So that just leaves me with one more thing to say, and it's a thank you again to Emily and Denise. Thank you very much for your time, as precious as it is, sharing with everybody today these scenarios and stories, and most importantly, the advice and the help and the support is available to them. So again, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for attending, and hopefully we shall see you soon. Bye for now.